Given such conflicting accounts, interpreting Constantine's legacy becomes challenging. Later historians, those writing 50 years after Constantine's death, likely offer a more balanced perspective. By that time, the passions of his contemporaries, those who had either loved or hated him, had faded. Christianity had firmly established itself, yet it had become evident that it didn't necessarily lead to moral improvements. Even Christian emperors continued to kill and commit atrocities, showing that the nature of imperial rule remained largely unchanged. By the late 4th century, historians like Eusebius and other authors of histories described Constantine with a more tempered tone. They saw him as an emperor of his time. He ruled for a long time, enacted many laws, some good, some flawed. He started his reign well, but things declined over time. A recurring critique in this account was Constantine's extravagant spending. He spent lavishly, they said. He squandered wealth, gave generously, and surrounded himself with friends who feasted endlessly at his expense. This observation appears in multiple sources, suggests it contains a little kernel of truth. Constantine was also a shrewd politician who understood the importance of building consensus. One historian offers this summary of Constantine's reign. Constantine ruled for 30 years. In the first 10 years, he was called formidable, prestantissimus, earning respect for his great victories, even against the barbarians. In the next 10 years, he was called a bandit, ladro, as he seized part of the empire from his colleagues. In the final 10 years, he was seen as silly, or pupillus, a ruler who gave away too much and seemed disconnected from what was happening in his empire. This characterization reflects how Constantine was remembered 50 years after his death. Remarkably, events like the Signo Vince's vision of the cross in the sky at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which are so significant to us today, were barely noted at the time. Their importance was only recognized later. This raises a crucial question. Where do these stories about Constantine come from, and how much of them are true? To uncover the truth, we must examine the sources, a task that is far from simple. Two Christian authors who wrote shortly after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge provide accounts of what happened. The first, Lactantius, authored a work called The Deaths of the Persecutors. This is not an impartial historical account. Its central theme is that even a Roman emperor who persecuted Christians met a terrible end, slain by enemies, consumed by worms, or devoured by gangrene. In this dramatic narrative, Lactantius also describes Maxentius's death and Constantine's victory. According to Lactantius, Constantine was camped outside of Rome, near the Milvian Bridge, before the battle. He was warned in a dream to place the sign of God on his soldier's shield and to engage in battle. Upon waking, Constantine did as instructed, writes Lactantius. He marked the soldiers' shields with the name of Christus, or Christum, in scutis notat. He attacked and won. But what was the sign of God? Was it a cross? This detail is debated, as many scholars argue that Christians at the time used the cross sparingly. For Romans, the cross symbolized dishonor, a shameful instrument of execution. Early Christians faced hostility for their veneration to someone who had died on a cross, which made the symbol controversial in this period. At the beginning of the 4th century, crosses were not yet presented in Christian churches. For this reason, many scholars argue that Lactantius is likely not referring to a literal cross when he says Constantine marked the shields with Christus. Instead, he might be referencing to the Christian monogram, the H Rho, a combination of two Greek letters. It's like a X, and the Rho sign is a P. So it will be a P over an X, used extensively by Christians at the time as a symbol of Christ. The prevailing consensus among scholars is that Lactantius is describing how Constantine, following his dream, ordered the Christian monogram to be placed on his soldiers' shields. This leads us to an intriguing question. Could Constantine have truly emerged from his tent that morning and told his troops, "I had a dream"? If so, what are the implications of such a claim? Did Constantine genuinely have this dream? That is something we can never know. It's possible Constantine himself may not have been certain, and the truth is lost to history. But if we entertain the possibility that he did dream, then it is plausible indeed, highly probable, that he relayed this to his soldiers, declaring, "I had a dream." This probability is supported by patterns in ancient historiography. Victorious generals in antiquity frequently claimed to have had prophetic dreams before decisive battles. There is a German scholar that even compiled a collection of examples of this recurring theme. The triumphant general whose dreams are foretold his success, and his name is Franz Xaver von Bader. In the earlier 19th century, he published a work titled To Dream Stories, or Tales of Dreams. In this work, he examined the role of dreams in the lives of historical figures, those who claim to have had prophetic or significant dreams before important battles or events. Why was this such a common narrative? Perhaps many of these generals genuinely had dreams, whether due to pre-battle stress, their diet, or the superstitions of the time, or perhaps they anticipated having such visions given the tradition of dreams preceding military victories. And even if a general hadn't actually dreamed, he was still strategically advantageous to step out of the tent and proclaim to the assembled people, "Legions, I've had a dream." Such declarations would inspire morale, instill confidence, and strengthen the troops' resolve before an important battle. If this story were true, if Constantine really had told his soldiers, "I had a dream," we must place the symbol of Christ on our shields. We might reasonably expect to find some evidence of this symbol on the shields of his soldiers from that time. This leads to a critical question. Do we have any visual representation of Constantine's soldiers from the period of his great victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge? The answer is yes. Yes, we do. One prominent example is the Ark of Constantine, erected 3 years after the battle. The bas-reliefs on this monument depict various scenes from the conflict between Constantine and Maxentius, including many of Constantine's soldiers with their shields. However, do these shields display any Christian symbol? Not at all. They bear only the traditional emblems of the Roman legions. Why is this the case? Art historians suggest that the omission of Christian symbols might be due to the influence of the pagan Senate, which financed the construction of the Ark. At the time, the senators were still predominantly pagan and may have preferred not to include Christian imagery. Are there other depictions of Constantine's soldiers from this period? Yes, there are. Where can we find them? On coins. Constantine mints produced countless coins in various designs, many of which prominently feature soldiers. This is not surprising, since one of the primary purposes of the coinage in the Roman Empire was not only economic exchange, but as we understand it today, but rather the distribution of gifts, particularly to soldiers. Gold coins, for instance, were often minted for gifts, special distributions to generals, troops, and other influential figures. These coins frequently depict soldiers accompanied by inscriptions such as Fides Militum, the loyalty of the soldiers, or Gloria Militum, the glory of the soldiers, and on. And on these coins depictions, there is no evidence of a soldier carrying a shield marked with a Christian emblem. This brings us to an alternative explanation. While it's possible that Constantine truly did wake up that morning and tell his soldiers, "I had a dream," there is another possibility to consider, that the story was invented by Lactantius. Could Lactantius have fabricated it? This is not out of the equation. Given his background. Yeah, because Lactantius was a rhetorician, trained in the art of crafting eloquent speeches and compelling narratives. We even have rhetorical manuals from his time, the very text studied by rhetoricians like him. These manuals explicitly advised, when you need to glorify an emperor, invent favorable dreams. Up to this point, we have a source, Lactantius, telling a story, leaving us to decide whether to believe it or not. However, you might have noticed something. We haven't yet discussed the famous story of the cross in the sky, accompanied by the phrase "in Signo vinces," "in this sign you will conquer." That's because Lactantius doesn't mention it. For him, it was all about a dream and the Christian monogram on the shields. The other significant author who recounts a version of this event is Eusebius of Caesarea. As mentioned earlier, Eusebius wrote in Greek, was a devout Christian, and a close associate of Constantine. He authored two key works: The History of the Church, written shortly after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and The Life of Constantine, completed many years later. In the story of the Church, Eusebius recounts the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, but makes no mention of a dream, vision, or miraculous event. It's completely absent. No apparition, no divine sign. This is notable because Eusebius was not only a historian, but also one of the first to make extensive use of archival documents in his work. He includes imperial edicts and letters he claims to have found in archives and transcribed. For example, this is going to result hilarious to believe, but he cites a letter purportedly from Jesus Christ to the king of Syria, in which Eusebius says he personally found in the archive of Edessa and translated from Syriac. While this raises some skepticism, he is still regarded as a serious historian for his era. Yet when writing the history of the Church, Eusebius recounts the battle without mentioning any supernatural elements. 20 years later, however, in The Life of Constantine, written after Constantine's death, Eusebius presents a very different account, one much closer to the story we're familiar with today. According to The Life of Constantine, before the campaign against Maxentius, Constantine experienced a vision. Interestingly, Eusebius does not situate these events the night before the battle, as Lactantius does, in the context of the dream. Instead, Eusebius places the vision at an earlier time, describing it as occurring during the day while Constantine was awake and praying. This distinction is significant, as even in antiquity, people still understood the difference between having a dream and having a vision while being in a waking state. Eusebius claims that Constantine himself personally recounted the story to him many years later, and he insists he knew Constantine well, having spent considerable time at his court, and swears that the emperor related the events exactly as he describes. According to Constantine's account, while he was praying, he saw a trophy of light in the shape of a cross appear in the sky. Alongside this luminous cross was the inscription "In Signo vinces." Eusebius recounts the inscription accompanying Constantine's vision in tuto nica. With this, you will win. The slogan is imperative. With this sign, the cross, achieve victory. Eusebius also claims that Constantine confided in him personally, recounting the details of the vision. According to Eusebius, Constantine said the event occurred in broad daylight, visible to both him and his entire army. Eusebius adds that both the emperor and his soldiers were astonished by the sight. This account raises an obvious question. If the entire army supposedly witnessed this miraculous event, why did Constantine only mention it privately to Eusebius? Privately. How is it that no one else seemed to speak of it and no other sources corroborate the event? While it may be tempting to suggest that Eusebius fabricated the story, the situation is more complex. We have records of speeches Eusebius delivered in Constantine's presence, and in these, Eusebius repeatedly refers to divine intervention, saying, God showed you his sign, the sign of salvation that drives the enemies away. This suggests that Eusebius was indeed relaying what Constantine himself believed and had communicated to him. It appears that Constantine in his later years had come to genuinely interpret events in this way. By then, the emperor was firmly convinced of his Christian faith, frequently claiming, I have always been a Christian, guided by the God of the Christians. For Constantine, these beliefs became part of his personal